Hey, readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and this is Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm joined in this episode by J.S. Dewis, author of The Last Watch. This science fiction adventure starts on the very edge of the universe, where a lonely military ship sits watch over the Divide. It's a quiet, isolated life for a bunch of misfit soldiers dropped where they can't cause any more problems. Quiet until the Divide itself starts to collapse, and they find themselves unable to send warnings or signal for help, and with very limited chance of escape. With everything at stake, the ship's commanding officer must rally every bit of ingenuity, competency, and courage from her crew of cast-offs and exiles, because the very survival of humanity depends on them. The Last Watch is fast-paced, character-driven space opera. It's the first book in the Divide series, arriving April 20th from TOR Books. And Jenny, welcome to Fictitious.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
I have to start off this interview with a lament. And that lament is that because I have had one hell of a week leading up to this show, including having gotten the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And let me tell you, that thing hit me like a wrecking ball.
Oh, jeez.
I'm super happy and lucky to be vaccinated.
Yeah,
But
yay, though.
I got every symptom that you can get from that
Oh
thing.
my
It got
God.
taken down for a couple of days. The downshot of that is that I'm only 150 pages into The Last Watch. The upshot and why I lament that is because it's so damn good that I'm really pissed off that I am only 150 pages into it before having this conversation. Because I was up till like 2 a.m. bleary-eyed and not wanting to put the book down because I really, really like these characters. I like this world a lot. I like the flow of the story. I like that it's character-driven. All of those things are really enjoyable and exciting to me. A while back when I was first approached about this book, your publicist Carol Perney from TOR had sent it my way and had, the description of the story. And basically I wrote back to her, I was like, Carol, is this competence porn? And she was like, oh yes, Adrian, it's competence porn. And I was like, yes, because that's my trope. That's my thing. I love competence porn. I don't know if that's how you would describe it, but that's how a lot of this hits me. So how do you describe The Last Watch? How do you pitch this to people whenever you're kind of, telling people about this book?
Yeah, well, I would say I agree that it's competence born. I had not heard that term until my editor randomly said it to me at one point, and I was like, yes, that is the thing. That it is. Normally I lead with it's a Night's Watch from Game of Thrones in space, which typically, hooks people from the beginning. But ultimately, it's the story of a outcast commander and her, crew of misfit soldiers who have to stop the universe from collapsing.
Yeah, pretty straightforward and
Yeah.
also terrifying. And I want to dig into all those different pieces because there's a lot of times where books get blurbed these days in ways that don't actually work. I mean, I've so many times have seen like, oh, it's the Game of Thrones meets this or something like that. And then the end result is a novel that doesn't really meet any of those things. It's just kind of a marketing blurb. In this case, I mean, I think Night's Watch meets the Expanse, or I mean, I've seen people make like Battlestar Galactica kind of comparisons, and all that makes sense to me. The Expanse certainly in that kind of space opera zone, and sort of like the Isle of Misfit Toys of people who get lumped together and have to save the world or universe or everything. In a lot of ways, I thought a little bit about the things I like most about Star Trek, which is again, it's competency. It's people who take their duties seriously or don't, but, step up when the time, calls for it. And I don't like to make tons and tons of comparisons and stuff. I know that that's what reviewers are there to do and stuff like that. And when you're writing something, you're creating something wholly on its own, but we are building on things that we recognize. And that Night's Watch comparison is apt because this is a group of people, the Sentinels, who are stuck on this outpost in the middle of nowhere doing, a job nobody wants. And there's a reason why they're all jammed out there. So I think as we contextualize what this world is and talk about your world building, let's talk first about what the Divide is. And then let's talk about the Sentinels and why they end up with this particular job. So let's start with what is the Divide?
So the Divide is the edge of the universe ultimately, and there's a physics explanation of what it is and how it came into being, but really they don't know exactly that much about its composition or how it came to be or anything like that. So it's just kind of the end of reality for them, but in their in their sort of mythos or lore, they believe it to be the origin of the Viator species, which is the alien race that they were at war with for a millennium. And, it's kind of the place the boogeyman came from. So at the end of that war, that's when they set up, this system of outposts along that edge to kind of keep watch there and to make sure, that they don't return after they've been kind of eradicated. So
I thought it was interesting to have a space where we have this idea that the universe just goes on forever and that it's ever expanding. And this is a sufficiently advanced exploration race of humanity that has gone out and they're like, oh, no, there it is. That's the end. It's like finding the end of the internet, like it feels like there's not a thing that exists, but maybe. And, and they got out there and they found a spot that they think that there's no way to go past it. There's no way to like go beyond it. Getting close to the divide causes some oddball things to take place as well. There's really early on in the novel, there's a moment where the ship's captain, that's not her actual rank, and we'll talk about some of those ranks and stuff in a minute. But Adequin Rake, who's one of the main characters, walks onto her bridge and then has to deal with the fact that like another version of herself walks onto the bridge as well. And essentially this doppelganger, and she has to kind of sigh and be like, oh no. And I think somebody even says something to her, like, they're like, don't engage with her, because they're literally in this weird part of space where occasionally there are time anomalies, and you will see these little moments where characters will appear and walk around and interact with people for a second and then just kind of glitch out and fade away. And whenever that happens, they know that they have drifted just a little too close to the divide. And that opening is something that initially feels like, oh, this is just kind of a neat little quirk of the story. But even at 150 pages in, I can tell when I see Chekhov's gun. And I've seen numerous of them, so, and granted, 150 pages, I know where things are going to, but there are certainly a lot of elements that are set up where we get an understanding of this is what this world is, and this is how this stuff works. That time issue is a thing that really pulled me in, and I liked a lot. Thinking about the Sentinels, a lot of these people have been exiled out here for a number of reasons. They're miscreants. They've been court-martialed. Some of them have been put away for political reasons. They have a lot of different roles. I mean, this is a military operation, but we're not operating with lieutenants and colonels and things like that. You have a lot of very specific in-universe names. And at least early as where I'm at in the novel, it's not clear that this humanity has any connection to Earth or like sort of Earth culture at all. Because when they name places, there are these other colonies and prime core worlds and stuff where people are from. And it feels very, very far from where we're at now. So can you kind of talk about what some of these roles are? What is the hierarchy in place there amongst the Sentinels? And then I want to talk about like how you bring details like that out slowly without overwhelming the reader.
So, yeah, I think, part of my reasoning there for swapping them out for what might be considered a normal rank structure was just to distance the world from our world. I didn't want it to feel like, oh, this is 500 years or 2,000 years in our future. I just wanted it to feel like its own universe. And, I have some sort of loose world building threads in the back of my mind of how maybe it kind of got to that point. But it's sort of almost a Battlestar Galactica line where, yes, it's the Earth colonies maybe, but none of their planets is planet Earth named something different. This is just other people somewhere else in the universe, in a different universe maybe. So that was kind of my big thing, because as I started writing it, I was like, oh, maybe this person would be a lieutenant. I was like, this sounds really weird to me. It sounded too dry, and I love military sci-fi. It's one of my favorite subgenres, but I didn't want it to feel too military sci-fi in that way. I wanted it to feel a little more, not fantasy, but space opera, I guess, just a little more distanced from that. So I just started playing around with, I like when I'm writing to kind of pick a sort of origin culture from our cultures to kind of draw inspiration from, as far as naming structures and things like, and made up words and things like that. And I just went with Latin probably because I love Codex Alera, and I just wanted to pick one that, I could pick a lot of names from pretty easily and kind of play around with. So I just kind of went with the Legion, and I pantsed the whole book, so there wasn't really a whole lot of thought that went into the original planning of this. But as I started realizing what I was doing, I kind of honed down on it more. And it definitely was more confusing, I think, for people when I first wrote it and people read the first draft of it, because I threw in all kinds of ranks left and right and all kinds of words and things. And I was like, okay, I need to pull back on this and only give a rank when I intend to use that rank pretty frequently, throughout the entire book. So hopefully it's a little easier now. I know it will still probably confuse some people, but hopefully they'll be able to find their footing okay.
Yeah, it doesn't take too long to get up to speed on a lot of it. And there was like I think in the one of the first chapters with Adequin, like she goes to talk to basically her second command on the bridge, this guy named Jack North, and he has his position is called an Optio. She references him as both Jack and as Optio, and there was a moment where I was not sure. I'm like, wait, are there two different people named North here? I wasn't sure. Is that a name? Is that a position? And it becomes clear very quickly. And I don't mind working. I mean, I say that on the show all the time. I like to work in a novel. So I like having epiphany moments of being like, oh, okay, I get it. Because it makes me feel smart. But certainly, I mean, anything where you're introducing something wholly new in the sense that, a new naming scheme that people have to get up to speed with, there can be a little bit of a learning curve. I always wonder about that now. I mean, as a person who's been reading science fiction and fantasy since I was a kid, I don't find much barrier to entry in most stories unless the science is super hard, because that's not really my bag. And I see sometimes when I look at like Goodreads reviews, how people will respond to stuff like, oh, I'm not really much of a sci-fi reader, and so this feels a little impenetrable. And I'm not talking about this particular novel, but just in general, they'll be like, sci-fi themes are always impenetrable to me. And I always think, I'm like, I mean, they're no different than anything else. It's just a matter of building context. And speaking of the context in this world, like, I think every time we go into science fiction, we do carry things of like, people understand what a spaceship is. They probably know what you mean when you say faster than light drives or warp drives, things like that. Specifics of them may change to world, but we get the idea of them. Most of the time, if you say to a sci-fi person, well, there's a big gate, and they're like, oh yeah, I get gates. Yeah, of course. Because, we've read enough and we have that kind of context. You've built a world here where it's clearly a very advanced civilization. It's spacefaring at the edge of the universe. They've done some incredible things. Although a lot of that world background is very background. We get little pieces here and there, but we only know as much as people say in conversation. There are definitely like, info sections, but you don't ever dump, here's the history of the universe. We don't know that to start off with. And I'm good with that. But there's something also kind of low tech and very lived in about this world. Some of their tech feels kind of junk. There's times where their computers feel like they're kind of sketchy, like they're maybe not operating at a level that you would expect for something that's out watching the very edge of the universe. And then they also have pieces of this alien technology and the alien race you talked about, and we want to get to them in a second. Can you kind of describe more about like what you were thinking when you were building this world, that blend of like, it's far-flung future, but maybe everything's kind of piecemeal as well? Like, what was your approach to that? What kind of mood were you trying to generate? And what does that create as a context for the characters in this environment?
Yeah, so I think I was definitely sort of subconsciously channeling Battlestar Galactica probably again in that, they're retiring this old ship, and then that's the old ship that they have to deal with then for the rest of the series. And that's kind of the situation with the Sentinels as well. And this is another thing that I kind of pantsed and didn't plan, but I've been dealing with more as I write the second book, in that kind of low-tech situation is really the situation the Sentinels have been saddled with specifically. They're given these old ancient warships that haven't been used in hundreds of years, and that's just the technology that they have, and any supplemental technology they get or whatever leftovers the Legion has in the back of the warehouse that if they have to send them something. So it's kind of a situation where, in this book, it's very much, things do feel that very low tech, and they have to kind of jury rig a lot of things. And it's, a lot of work just to get the tech to do what they want. Whereas in the second book, we kind of get to see, oh, this is how actual society has the technology that they have. And you kind of realize in retrospect, oh, they really did kind of shit on the Sentinels, didn't they? Because at first you do get that vibe that, oh, this is just how the world is. And then you're like, oh, wait, no, this is just how their world is. And everyone else is living a better situation than they are.
There's a number of conversations in there where people were like, well, I mean, we just need a warp core, right? And they're like, yeah, we don't have any of those. Okay, well, do we is there a ship with a FTL drive? They're like, no, they won't give us one because we might leave. They're like, oh, that makes sense. But, well, then how do we leave? And they're like, we don't. And it goes around where you're like, oh yeah, you can get where, like, I mean, these people they've been left out here where people just really don't care all that much, and they don't really want to deal with them anymore. So they have a job, but it's a job nobody thinks is really doing much of anything. So that creates a sort of a cascade of problems for them, which is that they have to problem solve their way around the thing where, like, okay, when the divide, like I said at the top, like starts to collapse and starts to basically move inward, which causes a whole lot of problems, which could be the complete annihilation of everything for all they know, trying to get away from that ship and go to anywhere when you're out in the vastness of space and you don't actually have, a warp core handy, or do they? That can be a big time challenge. So also, like you mentioned earlier, so you mentioned the Viator, who are this alien race who initially we know is just having been a group that were at war with humans for a long time. They've been technically dead or gone for at least a couple of 100 years, but then also there was a skirmish somewhat recently, some of which has been kind of covered up. There's been some biological blendings with their race as well, which is, something you kind of hint around with a few of the characters in it. A lot of the technology left over from them has influenced the humanities tech, including like the gates and stuff. So, and clearly I don't want to get too spoilery here. And you are pretty vague about them in the beginning of things, but what can you kind of tell us about that alien race and what, like, the impact of them in this universe?
It's definitely a situation where most of the technology that we might see as more magical in origin would be coming from the Viators, so their relay gate technology. I hint at one point, I don't know if you would have read that part yet, but where they talk about the warp core drive being based in Viator technology. That's a situation where humanity had their own. It wasn't as efficient. They stole the aliens. It's way more efficient. So humanity was very much a spacefaring race prior to the Viators' arrival or first contact. They just weren't nearly as advanced. So they've jumped ahead a few, probably centuries, maybe a little on the higher end of centuries because of this technology, but they were on their way there anyways. And then some of the things, like there's a couple of the characters have what are called imprint tattoos. So they're basically nanotech tattoos that give them certain abilities, strength, speed, reflexes, things like that. And that gets a lot more expanded in the second book as well. But that's another thing where humanity has been trying to recreate this technology, but they just can't. So they have a limited number of machines that can apply them, a limited number of applications. So they're kind of reserved for the most elite of the elite, which happens to include two of our main characters. They definitely owe a lot of what they've accomplished to the Viators, which kind of leaves this sort of lingering awkwardness of, well, they tried to kill us, but also where would we be if we hadn't encountered them, which is kind of another interesting world building element.
You mentioned that a couple of the characters are from this sort of elite class of soldiers that were in those fights. So we mentioned Adequin Rake, who is the captain of the ship, which is a job she's not wholly qualified for. She's incredibly competent, but the Argus, which is the ship that they're on, like you said, is like, it's basically a hundreds of year old battleship that's been decommissioned down to like just basically a floating rock in space that everybody hangs out on. It has weapon systems, but they're old and unmaintained. Whole sections of the ship are just kind of shut down. And then you have somebody like Adequin who's sitting there who, if anybody actually looks into her past, is notable because she was what was called a Titan, which is like an elite class of warrior and something of a war hero herself. And there's a ship that goes, and we'll get really in the weeds here. I'm going to try to avoid doing that too hard, but there is a exploration / like sort of testing and repair ship that launches off of the Argus, and its captain is a long-term friend of hers, also a Titan, also something called a Vanguard, also something called a Centurion. There's a lot of layers and names on these people, but they are like elite class people who have been stuck out on this thing. And I think there's a moment, about a third of the way through the novel where one of the characters kind of stops and is like, wait a minute. I mean, this is a bunch of miscreants out here on this thing, but there's like two venerated war heroes, and this other character in the Optio, Jack North, who's like has also an elite background, where there's a lot of people who've kind of been court-martialed and shoved off into the end of nowhere, that there's a significant advantage to having those types of people there, which I think is a lot of the fun, and again leads into that competence porn side of things. And in a minute, I really want to talk about Adequin, and I want to talk a lot about Cavalon Mercer, who's kind of our sort of intro character. I think it's always fun when you have the new character who steps into an environment and gives us fresh eyes into it. But I do want to step back to a couple of things. One is the inciting incident in this novel happens like maybe 75 pages in. And I feel like there's been a push in a lot of books lately, it seems to me anyway, to like get the inciting incident as close to the front of the novel as possible. Like if not in the first chapter, like sometime, really, really close to the front. And here in this like 450 page novel, you've got it 75 pages in. And that's okay with me, because those 75 pages are all character development and context and stuff that make us really care about these people before things really go to hell. But I'm curious for you, and now you said you were pantsing this, is that something you were aware of, that you're like, it was taking you a while to get to the inciting incident? Did you get editorial feedback on that? How did that look like in the development process? And how did that affect your approach to pacing?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, very much pantsed. So it wasn't planned at all necessarily to, I need to have this spot go here. Until very recently, I didn't really ever look at plotting structures at all. It just kind of happened by accident. In retrospect, looking back at it, I can obviously point to the idea that intrinsically I felt like it needed that context of setup, especially with the setting being as sort of, wait, where are we? At the edge of the universe? How is that a thing? There's a lot of reader questions that go into a concept like that. So I felt like it was really important to root the reader in the setting and make them care about the characters, obviously, before throwing the universe is collapsing in their faces, because it's just a lot to bite off. Like if you're reading a chapter 1 and you're like, the universe is collapsing, you're kind of like, okay, do I care yet? So I definitely wanted to make sure all that was fleshed out adequately. And I think to kind of combat that from like a perspective of, if you're looking at it from a plot structure perspective, there is an inciting incident sort of at the end of chapter 1 in Cavalon meeting Rake, and that's kind of the start of his character arc, and you can kind of see that as a, propelling that part of the story forward into the next bit until we get to the plot inciting incident, which just happens to happen a little later. And yes, it's nice when those things can correlate, and I would argue that Rake's somewhat correlates with the plots, but sometimes you got to kind of pull those pieces apart to get the best story out there, and I just felt like that was going to be better if we had enough context ahead of time.
With that much character interaction early on, and not a lot of like action, if you will, early on, in pacing that, making sure that that you had a consistent flow, that you had momentum. And I should say, I mean, like, there's a lot of momentum, even though it is character and dialogue heavy. I'd never had any sense that there was a flagging of momentum in it. And I think that's saying something. I mean, dialogue can always move a book quickly, but when you are trying to contextualize a whole lot of characters and a lot of world and make these things work, you can easily get bogged down with info dumps or too many times of a character stopping and going, now I remember that one time I did that thing, because it's important that you know that, because that'll matter later, which happens in stories all the time, because we need to get inside a character's head and learn something about them, but can really drag a story to a halt. Again, you were pantsing this, but that also means you had to go back in revisions and look where things needed to be tweaked or fixed, and getting editorial kind of feedback. And so I'm just wondering what that looked like in revisions, what that looked like from feedback, what you had to do to kind of make sure that that was all tight and functioning and moving quickly.
I would say structurally, it barely has changed at all since the first draft, and that's just total luck. I have no idea how that happened. I, again, didn't plan it. I did go in and flesh a lot of things out, though. It was by no means short to start with. It was actually very, very long. But in getting quite a few critique partners and beta readers to read through things, I was able to kind of hone in on, okay, this is how people are confused later in the book. How can I return to that beginning part and make sure things are clear ahead of time? And a lot of that is just Cavalon's not his purpose, because I didn't write him that way on purpose, but him being the newcomer to the show is him being the reader in that situation. And, he's able to get a lot of things explained to him in a relatively succinct manner because of that, which I can say for any aspiring writer, that's a good way to go if you can. Because it is always awkward when we have these characters who we know that they know the situation, but they're talking about it anyways. And it's just kind of like, you would never have this conversation normally. But if you're throwing a new person in the mix, then they can ask all the questions that the reader would have and get reasonable answers, as well as, just kind of having some of those internal narration dumps where you're like, this is how a thing is, and it's just more convenient sometimes to explain it that way. But if you have fewer of them thrown in there, it's usually, a little more tolerable.
We've mentioned Cavalon a bunch of times, so I think it's probably a good moment to focus in on him as a character. I read a Goodreads review where they referred to Cavalon as pure of heart and dumb of ass, and I really, really liked that. It made me laugh a lot. So we have a character here who is brought to be a member of the Sentinels, but unlike the rest of the people on board, he's never been a soldier. He is a member of the royal family of this sort of informal autocrat that runs a section of the galaxy or the universe. We get the sense early on that he's done some things that perhaps were well-intentioned, but not executed with any level of wisdom, because if this guy had a D&D stat, a dump stat, it would be wisdom, pretty darn low in it. But he's extremely well schooled. He knows his way around a number of different subjects, and he has some of these royal tattoos. He has those tattoos you were talking about that have this sort of nanotech. What more can you tell us about Cavalon as a character? What motivates him? How he figures into this story? And I think that's a good area to kind of flesh out what those tattoos do as well.
Yeah, so Cavalon is definitely the, sarcastic, not really a playboy, but, sarcastic, well-off, affluent, has no idea about normal society, and has some kind of dark things happening in his past that, we get into as the book goes on. I called him in a different article sort of the cosmic balance to Rake, who is, very competent, knows what's going on, but doesn't necessarily have the book smarts that Cavalon has, and they're really able to balance each other a lot in that way. And as far as his imprints, that's kind of an interesting thing, because I'm not sure if you've gotten to this part yet, but there's a point in the book where Rake is kind of talking to Cavalon about his imprints, and he realizes he knows nothing about them, that it's just a thing he got because he's affluent, and it's the thing that they do. They give their, you come of age at 18, you get your imprints, and then you have them, and you kind of know what they do, and, he's used them to get out of bar fights and ridiculous other things, but he hasn't really trained them or looked into what they're about. And that's kind of, a mirror into how he exists as a whole. He kind of surface level understands things, but doesn't always, understand fully. And we get to know a little bit more that he's kind of put up some walls, as far as he's a little more savvy than you think he is at the beginning of the book, politically speaking, and he's just kind of socially inept in a way, which is super fun to write. But yeah, as far as the imprints, it's kind of like Rake has been trained, has hours and hours, and understands how they work and knows every creative way to use them. And Cavalon just has no clue in the world. So that's just kind of another cultural divide type thing that kind of showcases how, different he is than everyone else on the ship.
Well, something I like in the dynamic between those two is that Cavalon has an inability to stop his mouth a lot of the time. He makes a lot of quippy comebacks. He's always got a joke for something. He's a very irreverent personality. Adequin is very serious most of the time. And but I appreciated that there's an element of whenever she's looking at him, it's half like, oh my God, you're going to be such a pain in my ass. And at the same time, a little bit of a difficulty kind of keeping a straight face. She can recognize that he has competencies. She can recognize that that there's a growth potential there, that he's also probably his own worst enemy, and that he's just funny enough, just amusing enough to ignore or let slide some of his BS. And so every time they'd interact, I appreciate it, because normally you get that sense of like that stiff upper lip military commander who just has no time for that person, and they don't interact well. And so very quickly you can see that. I mean, a lot of people hate Cavalon right off because he's that guy who never makes a good first impression, but there are people that he starts to interface well with, and that becomes fun very, very fast. The Sentinels dynamic, I think, is interesting to talk about here too, because they are a military squad, but they also are made up of a lot of people who've been shuffled off and hidden away in a place basically to be forgotten about. So that makes them military compatriots. And in a lot of ways, I think there's a found family trope kind of at play here as well. But there's also almost like a prisoner fellowship sense to this, because these are people who are stuck here. They're not allowed off. They're not allowed to leave. I mean, the very first scene is Cavalon taking a rather invasive, like you're entering prison, bend over and spread them kind of moment, which is a pretty rough way to start a otherwise pretty amiable kind of vibe. So I'm really curious about that when you were kind of building that dynamic. Like, how much are you thinking of like, oh, cool, here's military fellowship, but also like this is kind of a prison dynamic, like building that amongst these characters? How much of that was in your mind?
Honestly, I didn't plan for them to even be to be this sort of prisoner situation until I had already started. It's just another thing that sort of, as I was writing, I was like, oh, these people are prisoners, aren't they? Cool, let's lean into that. So it wasn't like I had some grand plan necessarily on how to execute it. But I do think it works out well. I mean, it takes an otherwise group of otherwise maybe unlikable characters and gives you sort of an instant empathy for them, especially when there's so much mystery surrounding each individual person's reasons for being there, and some being justified, probably very much so justified, and others being maybe not justified at all. And you just get to kind of discover some of that as it goes on. So it was kind of more of just a character empathy situation, I would say. Like, how can we build some instant empathy without getting into every single character's elaborate backstories immediately? So I would say that's really my main motivation in wanting to do it that way.
And when you talk about like not everybody deserves to be there, I mean, that's something that's worth noting about Adequin Rake, is that where a lot of them are essentially exiled here, she has something that happened in her past where she accomplished a goal, and because of learning something from that, she's been basically awarded a bump up of 4 ranks to the heading of this the ship, and then shuffled off to the middle of nowhere so that they can kind of quietly dispose of any chance that she can reveal that. Again, that would be a big spoiler, and for me, I only know that much of it at where I'm at in the novel. But what can you talk about that part of her background and how that affects what she does?
I mean, it's a big part of her character arc as far as, coming to terms with that course of events and understanding what it really meant, and kind of breaking herself away from the perception of it. Everyone around her has, she's famous, which isn't really shown that well while on the Argus, because they all already know her and it's just not a thing that really comes up. But it's explored a little more later in the book and in the second book. She ended the war basically, and that's kind of all we know. And then you come to learn the details of that event in such a way that, and how she's dealing with it, and some guilt surrounding it. And I mean, it does get into some pretty heavy spoilers, so I can't really say too much other than that, it's definitely an impetus for her character arc. And one of the bigger themes, I would say, of the book is perceptions versus reality, and how certain groups of people see things, and how history sees things, and who gets to decide that history, and those kind of things. So I would say that part of her character arc is definitely tied into that theme really strongly.
And thinking about themes, how much of that was something that you set out to explore? Did you know going into this like what you kind of wanted to say with it, or were they things that you discovered while you were pantsing your way through that first draft?
I would say it was pretty much entirely discovered. I went into it knowing some very basic things about the plot. It was actually originally a generation ship story where it was going to be a situation where the universe, was collapsing, but they were just going to try to go beyond and see what was going on the other side of that divide. And it obviously changed very drastically when I kind of discovered this group of Sentinels, and that keeping it in the universe that was collapsing would be far more interesting than leaving it. A lot of the themes I would say came up after the fact, but that's definitely a thing where revisions come into play pretty heavily, where you can, see, oh yeah, these are the things that I subconsciously glommed onto here, and I need to kind of play those up in these scenes and with these character arcs and things like that.
Now, we've said a couple of times that you did pants your way through this. It's worth noting this is your debut novel, but you have a number of screenwriting credits. What was the sort of relationship between what you've done for screen to writing a full prose novel? And as you go into the second book, which I should note, like the follow-up novel is coming out in August. So this is, a very, very swift turnaround for the next book in the series. So I'm curious, how is your writing process evolving as well?
Yeah, so The Last Watch was the second prose novel that I wrote. The first one was practice. um, we don't talk about it. But I pants both those novels, and that turned out pretty well for me pacing wise. And I think that is because of my history screenwriting. I had that, you have 90 pages to get a story out in a script form, and that's a pretty fast turnaround. You got to hit those beats pretty succinctly in order to get the story out competently. So I think, I didn't look at screenwriting structure as I started writing or anything like that. I didn't really think about it, but I've been writing scripts since I was 10 years old. So it just kind of is probably a natural thing that I can just do at this point without necessarily referencing that. So I think that definitely helped a lot. And as far as prose writing, I actually just started writing fan fiction out of nowhere. I fell in love with a couple video games, and I was like, I got some free time, I'll write some fan fiction. And then I was like, I could actually write a novel, couldn't I? Because I kind of know what I'm doing. So I just kind of started prose writing that way. And then I think between that and combining it with my, experience writing scripts, it kind of just naturally worked out.
Curious then, tools of the trade. What do you write in? And also, I'm very curious about this, since you are, you were a screenwriter first and then moved into this, like how that affects your choices as far as like actual writing tools.
So Scrivener is my main writing tool, I would say. I actually bought that back when I only wrote fan fiction, just because my process is pretty chaotic. I cannot write linearly to save my life. So having something like that where you can kind of move things around and see things from a broader level is pretty much essential to my process at this point, not to mention just all the other features that are fantastic about it. And then I use a program called Xmind, which is just a mind mapping software. But I've been using it ever since I started having to actually outline things, which is hard for me. But it really helps just to kind of dump all of the information I have in my brain out in a place, and then being able to move those blocks of text around. With Scrivener, you can kind of move around scenes or chapters, but like individual thoughts are a little harder. So it works really well for that, and I would very highly recommend it.
Xmind sounds really interesting, though. I have the only mind mapping literature and Latte has a mind mapping program as well, but it didn't really do anything for me. I think I tried a demo of it. And
yeah,
it was just...
Scaffold. I've used that too. I got that before I got Xmind, and I was like, okay, this is kind of doing the thing that I want it to do, but in a really inefficient manner. And then that's when I started looking for more different mind mapping softwares, and I tried a bunch of different ones before I found Xmind, and it's by far, for at least how my brain works, the best one.
That's very cool. Well, I'll definitely check that out. And that's the first time that's been mentioned on this show. So I always think that's really valuable. And I'll find a link for it and stick it into the description so people can check that as well. So The Last Watch, let me pick it up and bring it in here. The Last Watch, floating through the screen. Yeah. This book comes out on April 20th. The second book arrives in August. So, and I've seen a very big trend in that lately as far as getting series out faster. Because I know that for a lot of people that when they read, oh, it's the first book in a series and the second book isn't out, they put the book back on the shelf. So I know publishers have really been kind of geared up for that. But that means that people, don't have to wait too long before this next one arrives. Like I said, 150 pages in, I'm going to be sitting down and reading this again as soon as we get off this interview. Like I am really, really eager to get through the rest of this story because I'm very much enjoying it. And like I said at the top, I lament that I wasn't done before we got a chance to start speaking. But I'm very, very excited about it. I'm glad to share it, and I'm so happy to have had you on here. Where should people be following you so they know, book reveals and when next books are coming out and all that good stuff? Where are you at online?
Yeah, so my website is the, hub of all of that. So just jsdewes.com. I'm most active on Instagram, just because I'm a visual person, so I like to take the pictures and but I cross-post that to my Facebook, and then I'm on Twitter as well. I'm not super active on Twitter, but I do most of the major announcements and postings will end up on Twitter at some point.
Well, awesome. It's probably healthy that you aren't on Twitter that much because I don't find it that healthy to be in that particular environment. But I'm there all the time anyway. We all have our vices. This has been really great. I hope people check this book out. This is really fun. I mean, finding space opera that you can jump into where you love the characters, you get excited about it, you don't want the story to end, you want to stay involved. In a time period where my attention span is so fractured because of everything happening in the world, I find it hard to stay glued to things these days, which is really frustrating. And so finding something that feels like it had this momentum I just didn't want to let go of, that I didn't want to exit out of, has been really, really refreshing. So I'm excited to see where this series goes and to read everything that you have coming out later on. And Jenny, thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.